Sudan 2023 conflict. The conflict erupted on 15th April 2023.
Forces remain locked in a power struggle.
Intensifying clashes in Sudan.
The fighting in Sudan is a power struggle. It's a power struggle between two men.
Between rival factions of Sudan's military government involving the Sudanese Armed Forces, the SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, the region is centered around Khartoum and Darfur. At least 1,000 people had been killed and more than 5,100 injured by 16th of May. Sudan crisis or Sudan conflict has been widely discussed in many articles and videos, but what is actually happening in Sudan and what are the reasons is what I will be explaining to you today. Sudan is an African country with a mostly Muslim population. It is located in northeast of Africa. Its official languages are Arabic and English. It's one of the poorest countries of the world, and most of the population lives in extremely poor conditions. Since they are essentially isolated, the southern regions of the nation make it difficult to figure out their level of poverty. Despite the fact that it is well known that many people die from hunger or illness, on January 1st, 1956, the Republic of Sudan legally became independent from the nations of Britain and Egypt.
The Sudan, for 58 years under the joint rule of Britain and Egypt, becomes an independent republic.
As a result of decades of civil war and the loss of more than 2 million lives, South Sudan seceded from Sudan on July the 9th. Until southern Sudan's election for independence in 2011, it was one of the largest and most geographically expanded nations in Africa. Sudan's military removed al-Bashir from power on April the 11th, suspended the constitution and closed its borders and airspace. A 3-month state of emergency was also imposed. After nearly 30 years in power, al-Bashir is replaced by a transitional military government, but thousands of protesters camp outside the army headquarters. Generals and protest leaders failed to reach an agreement. The protest camp was attacked by armed men on June 3, 2019, and dozens of people were killed in the bloody crackdown that followed. The infamous parliamentary group Rapid Support Forces, RSF, which is suspected of committing war crimes during the 2003 Darfur War, is blamed for the destruction but denies any involvement. Civilian and military factions agreed to share power during a 3-year transition following the African Union's intervention, with elections set for 2023. Under Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok, a council of ministers also established a constitutional declaration is issued on August 17th, and 3 days later, a sovereign council made up of prominent military and civilian personalities is established. Now Sudan is run by a council of generals commanded by the 2 military personnel, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, the commander of the armed forces, who also serves as president of the nation, and General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, also known as Hemedti, who serves as his assistant and is the RSF's leader. Hemedti became the most powerful military figure in Sudan, but one of the richest. His vast wealth comes from the control of the Jebel Amir gold mines of North Darfur, which Hemedti took with inordinate amounts of bloodshed. Hemedti and Burhan began to build various revenue streams and international and internal agendas, and the army and the RSF each had their own advocates in the political and judicial devices, in addition to controlling a large portion of the gold trade. When everything was good, then what made them fight each other? Let's go into this briefly. General Burhan began to reinstall formal government officials to their prior positions. General Burhan's plan was obvious: restore the old regime of Omar al-Bashir to power. Hemedti had doubts at this time, since Bashir's cronies were not fully trusting of him, because he had betrayed them in the past, and historically Sudanese politics have been dominated by an elite largely drawn from the ethnic groups around Khartoum and the Nile. And Hemedti comes from Darfur. The Sudanese elite often refer to Hemedti and the soldiers as country bumpkins, unfit for state leadership. Over the last 2 or 3 years, he has tried to position himself as a national hero and even as a representative of marginalized communities. Forging alliances with rebel groups he was previously obligated to destroy. While his forces have brutally suppressed civilian protests in the past, he has also consistently emphasized the need for democracy. One sheath can hold only one sword at a time. The fight for supremacy began. Each party desires sole control of Sudan. The shooting began on the 15th of April, following days of tension as the army saw the RSF's redeployment around the country as a threat. There had been some hope that talks could resolve the situation, but these never happened. The World Health Organization estimates that more than 400 civilians have been killed in different parts of the country since the first shots were fired. Although it is unclear who fired the first shot, even though the war appears to revolve around the control of important sites, a large portion of it takes place in urban areas, making civilians the accidental victims. There are likely to have been civilians killed as a result of airstrikes conducted by the Sudanese Air Force in the capital, a city of more than 6 million people. Consequently, life in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, as well as in many other regions of the nations, have suddenly and dramatically worsened. Since the UK, US and EU have all called for a ceasefire and dialogue to end the crisis, several countries are now focused on trying to get their residents out of the war. What part do other countries now play in the war in Sudan? This would be bad news for Juba, whose economy depends to a large extent on oil exports, in fact 90%. South Sudan, which currently ranks third among the riskiest African nations, is at risk of becoming even more unstable as a result of any disturbance. The Salva Kiir administration would probably enter the fight on the side of the SAF if the RSF attacked oil infrastructure. Hence, one of the nations that could host negotiations over the present issue is South Sudan, which has recently hosted peace talks between the Sudanese state. Saudi Arabia is concentrating on Red Sea scrutiny since it is essential to its 2030 vision plan and Red Sea initiatives like NEOM. Saudi Arabia and the United States have been at the heart of attempts to achieve an effective ceasefire. Israel, which had been hoping to move forward in normalizing ties with Sudan, has also offered to host the talks. Diplomats and analysts say Egypt feels comfortable dealing with Burhan and sees him as the most likely guarantor of its interests. The United Arab Emirates, with Hemedti's most significant regional ally prior to the conflict, analysts claim that the UAE has also attempted to change its bets by maintaining links to Burhan and the army and joining the Quad, a grouping that includes the United States, Saudi Arabia and Britain, and has assumed leadership in diplomatic efforts against Sudan. Additionally, Hemedti has developed links with Russia. In 2022, Western officials in Khartoum reported that the Wagner Group of Russia was participating in it. These war crimes committed by leaders will always cause suffering for defenseless civilians, but for how long?